everyone. I think we're really very honored to be amongst you today with all your experience and backgrounds. And as we were talking before, I think the whole context in Iran, we're familiar with the general context in general, but it's still, we're missing on a lot, and it's so great that we're establishing this connection right now. So Hani and I are architects and urban planners, and we are going to speak about what's going on in Syria since 2011 from an urban perspective. So basically we're going to reflect on how urban processes during the Syrian conflict were manipulated to serve the political and economic interests of the regime. And there.
Okay, so
I think since 2011, Syria took a lot of the light in news and in general, and from an urban perspective, mostly the focus was on the physical destruction, the physical manifestation of the conflict in terms of the destruction of structures, houses, and infrastructure in general. Syria was described as hell on earth and the most acute humanitarian catastrophe in modern history. But again, mostly when people reflect on this, they look at the scale of destruction from a physical perspective. In 2017, I think documentation of destruction concluded that at least a third of the housing sector is destroyed now in Syria. But what we want to do in this event is to try to take a closer look of this destruction, because the different research that has been done around suggests that this is beyond a manifestation, a physical manifestation of the conflict. Destruction was actually a war tool in the whole Syrian conflict.
What we're referring to the act of using urban design or urban development or urban practices as a tool in the war by using the term herbicide. Herbicide is a term that is derived from the other term called genocide. Everyone knows what genocide is. Basically to kill or destroy a specific group of the community. And we refer to the act of using the urban tool, building or destruction, as a tool to destroy a specific group of the community as an herbicide. So herbicide has been widely used in Syria. We're in a country where everyone likes to see proofs, right? No one will accept just saying, okay, Syria witnessed herbicide. So we try through our presentation to prove that actually in Syria, herbicide has taken place since 2011 and until today.
Let's move the slides.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's literally the way how genocide was appropriated in urban studies, that they use herbicide, how the urban sphere is used to enforce the genocide. So just a little bit of theory. So herbicide as a term is developed around looking at how urban processes are used to kill diversity or to eradicate a certain group of people. What's critical is there, so how herbicide is different than destruction, is that herbicide looks at what's politically at stake when we look at what's targeted. So destruction, we just look at destruction. In herbicide, we look at what's targeted through this destruction and what's politically at stake in this act of destruction. So the general definition of that is the violent attempt to impose certain urban arrangements. It could be destructive or reconstructive urban arrangements, but the aim of that is to enforce homogeneity, which means to eradicate the diversity and plurality of certain communities. And yeah, funny enough, in 2017, in a speech for Bashar al-Assad, the head of the Syrian regime now, he said, we lost the best of our people and our infrastructure, but we won a healthier and a more homogeneous society. And then he emphasizes, I don't mean the metaphor of homogeneity, I literally mean a homogeneous society. So what we're going to do in this presentation is to see what tools the regime used to enforce this urban homogeneity.
To do that, we're using a framework or a manifestation of herbicide that Stephen Graham described in his writing. For those of you who doesn't know Stephen Graham, he's a scholar who written a lot about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and to describe the act of herbicide in the Palestinian-Israeli context, he identified the three different manifestation of herbicide. The first of which is destruction when it is systematic. So destruction can be normal as a collateral damage of anything as a result of a conflict, of a fight, but when it becomes systematically used, then it is one of the manifestations of herbicide for Stephen. The other one is the denial of the city to a particular group of people, denying them some of the services of the city or denying them access to some specific part of the city. Let's say, for example, this group don't have access to educational system or to water services or electricity services. So this is another manifestation of herbicide. The third of which is the discriminatory reconstruction framework. So when you do reconstruction, when you build things, but you don't build it for the good of everyone, but to benefit only a specific group of people. So those practices, as Stephen put them, are the manifestation of herbicide. So, and we'll try to see if those happen in Syria. But just as background, Syria, as you know, in 2011, after the kind of popular peaceful demonstration took place on all the street, the regime cracked the demonstration, and then it all turned into a civil conflict, armed group from the opposition fighting the armed group from the Syrian army and their allies. Eventually, the opposition groups gained control of suburbs of main cities, as well some towns and other main cities in different parts of the country. So the control of the opposition grew over time. The regime didn't like this because they saw, especially those, the areas around the capital of Damascus, they saw the control of the opposition of those areas as a challenge for their own power, and they didn't like it. The head of the regime went again and vowed to crush the opposition, who he called as terrorists. So every group which is not on the side of the regime is a terrorist group, and thus they employed tactics which became later known as a very widespread tactic of war, which is to bombard areas, siege them, circle them, and then evacuate everyone in those areas. So this tactic was used in Damascus and many other places, and now everyone knows that this is a tactic that the regime and its ally follow in their fight against the opposition. And then we go into now detail and examples of those practices.
So, in details, how urban arrangements were used in this military strategy to bombard, to siege, and to forcibly evacuate people. This is a map of Aleppo, Halab, and the map shows the level of destruction in the city, and we can clearly see that the destruction is actually concentrated in the eastern part of the city. So it happens that if we go to the other slide, that this is again the city of Aleppo, and it's the geopolitical control of the city. The green parts are the parts that were controlled by the opposition, and the red ones are the government-controlled areas. So again, the destruction is clearly mostly manifested in the opposition-held areas. And the opposition-held areas in Aleppo happen to be the most disadvantaged neighborhoods with the poor communities, mostly the migrants from the suburbs who came to the city, gathered around, started their informal settlements where they could actually work in the city center. Aleppo is the economic capital of Syria. So these areas, mostly informal, poor neighborhoods, were the areas where opposition was concentrated because of all the grievances that people live in these areas, and because of their accessibility to the suburbs where actually the opposition armed groups were building themselves in there. So they had better connections, they established themselves, this area became opposition-held area, and that's, when we look at destruction, we can clearly see that it is concentrated in opposition and informal areas. this is an example of Aleppo, but it could be taken as widely also. It could be reflected on Syria in general. So this destruction is caused by the war machinery. It's by barrel bombs that the regime invented, and by helicopters and planes and tanks. In Aleppo, and particularly in most of the neighborhoods, the documentation says that 4 buildings in each hectare is destroyed. And in the most destroyed neighborhoods in the east, they count 10 to 15 buildings in each hectare destroyed. The type of weaponry that was used is indiscriminatory. So we can see that the destruction is not just across can we go back to the destruction map? It's not just across the front lines between the 2 sides, but it spreads inside, targeting houses and vital civilian facilities, hospitals and schools. So it's not militarily justified between the 2, because it utilized indiscriminatory weaponry. And I think Amnesty in 2016 documented that 1 barrel bomb caused the death of 188 civilians and only 1 armed rebel. So that's how we conclude that it's not actually aimed at strategic military objectives.
Most likely this rebel, maybe it's just by coincidence.
By coincidence.
Just 188 civilians to die with a barrel bomb. It's just. And
in that year, the regime used nearly 13,000 barrel bombs, let alone planes and everything else. So just to have a little understanding of the scale of destruction that we're talking about.
But, I mean, moving to another tactic, one might argue, someone very kind of supportive to the regime might come and say, well, no, this was, the destruction was a result of the war, because there was an opposition on that side, and the regime had the right to kind of defeat those armed groups to free the city and get the people back into their town. So one might still kind of come and argue this. But if we read more about Syria, and we read more about some of the practices that happened when there was no kind of war in the area, we can learn other facts. In one of the reports in 2013, Human Rights Watch reported unlawful demolitions in Hama city and in Damascus city, where the regime came and bulldozed entire neighborhoods. So this is not by barrel bomb. It wasn't a result of fighting and destruction. It was intentionally going with bulldozers and razing entire neighborhood. And then when we speak about neighborhood, this is in 2013, not today. They spoke about an area which size is equal to 200 times of a football field. So it's huge areas of land. They just destroyed it, and thousands of residential blocks were destroyed. People were not having, they didn't get any warnings. Maybe some got, but the overall majority, they didn't get any warning and no compensation. So they just went and destroyed towns because they knew that those are opposition towns, or for other purposes they destroyed those areas. The officials from the government came and said, well, this is part of organizing the towns. We're destroying informal areas and we're trying to develop them. But if you think about it logically, within the time, I mean, when it was the war in its peak, and kind of the regime didn't have really even the kind of, we didn't know what's going to happen. They might have lost the war by then, but they decided to go on and demolish those neighborhoods. And it's very legitimate now to ask that, was it to change the demographic composition of this area?
I think officials informally, they then later stated that this was to drive opposition fighters from these areas.
Or they said as well to enforce the victories of the Syrian army somehow.
Yeah. Another technique that was widely used is the siege. The strict sieges that were enforced on different localities in Syria, and the politics of aid surrounding that in general. So this was used across the geography, and it's well documented by different organizations. PAX did a whole series called the Siege Watch, documenting in stages all the sieges that took place. in total, between 2012 and 2018, I think, 2.5 million of the Syrian population were subjected to sieges through different stages. When we say siege, we're speaking about restriction of mobility, so nothing comes in and nothing goes out. But we're also speaking, so the siege is going on in line with the bombardment from the sky and with land encroachment from the ground. So and with that, again, the target is not just military strategic locations, but it's mostly directed at vital civilian infrastructure and facilities. So we witness the cut of power sources, cut of water sources, targeting of hospitals, targeting of bread. Syria became known for what they call the bread massacres, targeting bakeries at peak hours. The first map, the first photo, is actually a map of Homs, and it shows the different stages of the siege of the city and how the area where opposition groups and communities were located was shrinking with time because of the encroachment of the regime. I think in terms of aid, the regime also manipulated access to aid. That was highly politicized and manipulated, and most of the UN's aid convoys were directed to regime-held areas. Of course, there are vulnerable people in there, displacement was happening in there, people relocating to there, but most of the aid was actually going to regime-held area. And I think in 2016, perhaps, it was documented that in Damascus, only 4% of the aid that was supposedly going to besieged areas was actually entering besieged areas. Otherwise, it was going elsewhere. And even worse than that, those little number of convoys that managed to get into besieged areas were always tampered by with the regime. So medical supplies were removed and vital food supplies were removed from them. And then they all ended in forced displacement.
Yeah, so I mean, basically after this bombardment, as I said in the beginning, it's a bombard, siege, evict. So the last phase, after people are really tired, they don't have any service, they don't have water, they don't have electricity, they don't have food, they don't have even hope that the convoys of aid will come in, and then they give them the option for truce. This is what they call truce, or reconciliation agreement, brokered by Russia and Iran and other. They come and say, well, okay, let's make a reconciliation agreement, so to find a solution for the people we're fighting. We're not killing you anymore, we're making reconciliation. And usually those truces, in many cases supervised by the UN, end up by evicting the population of the area. And people will have no other option. They'll find themselves, and we either live in these conditions, or we have to go under the regime control, which means that we were going to be persecuted, or we're going to go to prisons, and then or we leave to somewhere else where the opposition is in control. So in most of the cases, everyone who think he might be subjected to persecution, he'd leave and go to other places. And in some instances, like the area, for example, in the suburb of Damascus, the entire population left the city. And the city is a kind of suburban city around the city of Damascus. Until today, is a ghost city. People are not allowed to go back there. So it was emptied in full. And it's not the only example where entire city were abandoned and now they're just ghost cities. So truces, and even the UN itself kind of described those truces as a way to force surrender on the population. All different international human rights organizations describe those. I believe it's the Amnesty International who described it as a surrender. I mean, they have a report titled actually the strategy of surrender or die. So you either surrender and leave, or you die on your place. So this is the last phase of the siege.
And then to kind of enforce to sustain this kind of eviction, areas were blocked for their own residents to go back to. So the entire cities were entire population were moved out. Then there were procedures enforced on these cities so that people cannot actually go back. And we have cases where cities have been recaptured by the regime forces for 2 and 3 years now, and still people cannot yet go back. Not only those who were subjected to the forced displacement to other opposition-held areas, but those who flee during different times, and even if they are within accessible locations to the area, they still cannot go back. And for that, the regime deployed different techniques. So of course checkpoints guarding these locations, and some of them are highly restricted, so you need to go through very complicated procedures to acquire security clearance to get in, and others are completely blocked. But then the other concerning thing is that these areas, after have been recaptured by the regime, they've been subjected to demolition operations again. And here we have, this is an aerial photo of Qaboon in 2017, so right after the displacement of the people, and then this is in 2018 where we can see the scale of destruction. They destroyed intact and inhabitable structures, so people reported that they left their houses still standing, and then they found out that it was demolished after with bulldozers and with dynamite. The government justified that by saying that they were only bombing the tunnels that the terrorists created when these areas were besieged. So demolition, post-battle demolitions was one of the techniques, but also another aspect that was used is tampering with housing, land and property documents, and that included targeting the registries of properties so that people can't really claim their property rights, but it also included falsification of transactions, so people would find out later that their property was sold to someone else with legal transactions, legal documentation, although they're away, they haven't been engaged in this, and also by actually expropriating property of those communities without due legal procedures. So that was highly practiced, and it was mostly targeted against certain population, and then mostly again the confiscated property was awarded to militias, either for the regime or from the Iranian militias fighting alongside the regime forces in there.
So now, I mean, we are speaking about the destruction and how destruction has contributed to the homogeneity from, I mean, as it was envisioned by the government. But today the conversation is shifting slowly towards reconstruction and say, well, now the fighting is easing, the regime is back in control of the majority of Syria, or not the majority, but for the, what they call the kind of the useful Syria. So they have it back under the control, and now there's less fighting and less destruction. So maybe this is outdated. I mean, it's definitely not outdated because its results is still standing today. But today people are more about reconstruction. What's happening about reconstruction? Let's speak about reconstruction. But for us, or for us, as in Stephen Graham, what did they call it? Manifestation. The three manifestations of herbicide. We spoke about denying the city, we spoke about the destruction, but now it's the reconstruction. Reconstruction in Syria is happening in a discriminatory way, through which what happened through destruction is being consolidated to last as long as possible, and as well to be emphasized. In 2000, I believe in 2012 to 66, the law 66 was released, enacted by the president. According to this law, it was allowed to go and do, basically the law laid the legal and financial foundation to do reconstruction project in informal areas. So wherever there is an informal area, they can go, destroy those informal buildings, and expropriate the land and do development in there. We have two problems. The first, that most of those areas, the informal area, were opposition area, or people who would support the opposition, because they were people with less leverage, right? And then the second thing, that informality was, Syria big portion of Syria built environment was informal housing in informal areas. So by this, they targeted like a big percentage of the Syrian built environment. But then after that, after a while, in 2018, and this is when the regime started feeling that they won the war, there was another law, law number 10. Law number 10 took or expanded the scope of reconstruction to formal areas. So by this, there is no area that can be outside of reconstruction, of the reconstruction scope. Entire areas or big zones of land became designated as reconstruction area. This includes, for example, Syria city, which is an area of 900 hectares near Damascus city. It includes another area which we speak about in detail in a bit, which is called Marota city, which is around 200 or even more hectares of informal areas. So those areas and other areas in different parts of the country, they became designated for reconstruction. But what reconstruction we're speaking about, this is what we're going to speak about now.
Yeah, so this area is near Damascus city center, and it's called Basatin al-Razi. It's an informal area in there. The area, so demonstration took place in these areas, and people contributed to the revolution through different means. But the area never actually went out of the regime's control. So it was under the regime's control all the time. It's an informal area. So in the sense of informality, or what we call in Syria mukhalafat, that is a distinct form of informality than what we see in favelas or in Africa or in general, because mostly people do own the land in these informal areas, but it's rural land, and it happens to be outside the limits of master plans. And then because of all the bureaucracies, and because master plans are outdated and they haven't been updated for tens of years in Syria, so urbanism was actually growing outside the limits of plans, and people who owned the land eventually developed housing, although land use states that it's agricultural land. So they're informal in that sense only, but people in most cases own the documents of their lands. They either built houses or they subdivided the land and they transacted it within themselves in a way or another. In that sense, they became designated as informal.
Is that this presidential palace?
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's really in the center. It's actually near the Iranian embassy. It's near Damascus University. It is a very strategic area, but it's informal. So when Law 66 in 2012 was issued, Basatin al-Razi was designated as the pilot project for this law.
Sorry, you use informal, or these term you use it for random houses, or
Exactly.
these people.
For those houses.
For those,
Yeah.
they're
So
called
they are-
ashwaiyat.
Yeah, ashwaiyat, yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
so there is no document for
No,
Iran.
we're saying that they do have in many cases, they do have a deed for the land, so
Yeah.
they own the land, but they illegally built the house. So it should be agricultural land, but they broke the law and built housing. But this was, as Sawsan said, it was part of the, because of the failure of the government to provide enough houses.
Or to update master
So half
plans.
of the Masin, for example, living in those settlements. So it's not only group,
Yes,
it's not a group of
because
people.
we have the same in Iran,
Yeah.
in the margin of the cities, especially the industrial cities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Same in Aleppo. Same story
Yeah.
around most major cities, I think. So Basatin al-Razi was designated as the pilot project for Decree 66, which sets the foundation to deal with informal settlements in the context. Can we move to the other one? So the area was then called Marota City. So they decided that Basatin al-Razi is now going to be Marota City, and Marota City is the blueprint for the new Syria, for how reconstruction is going to unfold in Syria. What they did is that they actually expropriated the land, they evicted people, and they established an inspection committee that went and evaluated all the property and did the proper inspection and everything. And then they compensated people according to their formal status and to the results of the inspection. Based on that, people were either compensated with shares in the new development, or they were given substitute housing and annual rent. However, the valuation was based on their current conditions during the inspection, so with their informal status and poor conditions, and not factoring in the potential value of the new development that's yet to come. So people were issued where the value of people's property was based on that, and then the compensatory shares that they were given in the new development was what's equal to the old conditions. In this case, the result was that in some cases one plot of land was assigned for hundreds of families because of the imbalance between the shares before and after. People were also promised with substitute housing until they managed to develop their lands. Since 2012, these have not been constructed yet. They haven't even decided on a location for them yet. And then people were also promised with rent compensation. So some were promised with 2 years rent compensations, others were promised with annual rent compensation until they actually relocate to the substitute housing or they move back to the development. However, the complaints says that in the highly inflated rental market in Damascus, what was promised for a year is barely enough to cover rent for 2 months in there. Funnily enough, when people complained, local authorities responded saying, go rent in other informal areas. So that's the degree that was put in place to deal with informal areas. These are the results of it. Let's move to the other.
So in a way or another, we can, I mean, if this is not eviction in terms of like destroying a place and people get affected because of destruction, they were kind of, I don't like the term soft eviction, but it was some sort of another way of evicting people, indirect eviction. People had to leave their land in one way or another because they couldn't afford to buy a house in the same area or to develop, they didn't have enough to develop an alternative house in the same area. But just on top of that, the government expropriated part of this area and assigned it for residential and commercial building to give for investment. And it was, in all the cases, the contracts was giving to companies working in Syria. In all the cases, or in most of the cases, were companies known to be cronies of the regime. So companies with good relation to the government. So the money is circulating within exactly the cousin of the president or someone else with a good relation who made a favor for the government during the war, or in a way or the other maybe someone connected to an ally outside the country. So it was given for those people to make benefit, and then at the same time no contracts was made to investors to come and build those kind of alternative housing they spoke about to compensate local people. So no move on that front. But a lot of work on the other front to give contracts for those people to make money and benefit from the work. Actually, it was, I mean, it was the only way for the government to attract capital and do any sort of reconstruction is attracting those kind of the private companies' money through promises of kind of lucrative investment in the area. So this is how it's developed, and as I said, none went to support those people who are becoming or being evicted. What's, I mean, very striking about this image in specific, I mean, if you look about, sorry? Yeah, if you look at this image and the other image, I mean, the sort of buildings, it's very obvious they're not serving the local people, nor any of the people who were displaced from other parts of them. I mean, in a country where, like, I think it's 30% of the housing stock is destroyed, we need a lot of housing, right? But you would imagine every sort of housing, but not those type of luxurious housing. You think of maybe affordable, smaller house, maybe something that looks a little bit kind of looks affordable.
It was estimated that the cost of 1 square meter in the residential apartments developed by the government is $6,000. Now, who in Syria can afford that?
Maybe they don't.
Who would buy it? So what's going to happen to this?
Exactly. So it's put for investors. That's it. That's why actually it's concluded. Most of the work on this Marota city, and including interviews with the local residents of Basatin and Razi, they conclude that this it was not a way to address informality of Syria. It was a politically motivated gentrification process where they are softly evicting people. On the surface, it seems as if they are giving them access to high-end development, but in fact, the actual procedural requirements for those citizens to develop their compensatory shares is so complicated that majority of them opted for selling the shares out so that they can afford renting while the development is happening. The law was issued in 2012. Until today, only one building license was given by the government because of all the bureaucracy and everything, while tens of contracts were signed with the crony investments for the government return. That's why people think that it was a gentrification process. It was aimed at driving those poor population from this very strategic area elsewhere, so that the area is again in the hands of the government to award cronies and to actually keep it under control.
But I mean, it tells as well, it tells all those investors that the government is ready to make I mean, we have a lot of prime land built as informal settlement. It's ready to make those lands available for investment. So investors now think, okay, maybe this area will become available for investment. This is, okay, let's start doing investment in Syria because a lot of prime land will come and become available for investment. We want to buy them and develop them and make a lot of money. Housing is very expensive in Syria. It was expensive even before the war, so it's not something new, and it's, I mean, some people compare it to other cities in Europe and other places, how expensive it was even before the war. So having prime land is something very important for investors, and so it's kind of a new liberal approach for showing the whole world that we start reconstruction and there is an opportunity for investment. How much it succeeded?
And it's also important to look at this in the context of the restriction on the Reconstruction Fund of Syria. So because of the conflict, the EU and the US, they said that Reconstruction Fund will be blocked until there is a political settlement. But because there is no political settlement in the near future or in the horizon, I think this was the government's way of actually saying we don't need the EU and the US in the meantime, and we have our ways of funding our own reconstruction. They will need it eventually, and Putin, on behalf of the government, is lobbying the EU to unlock the reconstruction fund, and they're threatening with refugees and stability of the region. But this was the government's way of actually attracting investment money, again, from Syrian businessmen, from businessmen in the region, but also from non-traditional actors in India, in Japan, but also the government's way of rewarding its military allies, Russia and Iran, with all the investments that's yet to come in the country. This is how all the debt for the past 8-9 years is being paid now.
Yeah. But I mean, if you want to conclude just in one sentence, I mean, if we think of the main question about herbicide, have herbicide taken place in Syria? Was there any systematic destruction? Was there any denying of the city? Was there any discriminatory reconstruction which served political and economic interests of specific group, which is now the government and its crony, not the overall majority? Was there any of those? We can easily say yes, there was those practices. So there was a manipulation of the urban sphere in favor of, or to achieve some, or driven by political vision of the government.
So it was to serve political objectives, because mostly targeted against opposition-held area, but also economic interest of the government because of how it's stimulating investment. But also we can say broadly that it was also run across sectarian lines, because if you look at most of the areas that were targeted, they were Sunni areas, and the regime very, very cleverly played on the sectarian lines during the conflict in Syria. When property was confiscated from Sunni population, they were awarded for Shia militias, and most of the destruction and the falsification of property targeted Sunni areas. So again, the regime's narrative as being the protector of minorities in there was highly manipulated, even in the context of urban arrangements. That's what we have to say.
Yeah.
And we really look forward to hearing from your experience. You know the other side of the story. We know that the Iranian regime took part in the whole military strategy of the Syrian regime throughout the years, and we know that the regime is being awarded now with Reconstruction. The main sectors of oil and gas and tourism, including religious tourism, of agriculture. There are big contracts being signed with the Iranian government, such also with the Russians, so paying the debts and rewarding for everything. So, but that's the other side of the story that we are not familiar with. We're more focusing on what's happening on the ground in Syria, and yeah, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you mentioned, did any of these displacements actually got to new housing? You mentioned one example that they started building a new housing.
So the new development, part of the land was taken by the government and assigned to contractors, crony investors, and then the other land that was redistributed to people who qualified as per the inspection, where hundreds of families were assigned one plot of land, and they were asked to go through all the procedures to present designs such as these ones, so that they develop their lands, going through all the bureaucracy and the time and the costs of that. And after all these years, 7 years I think into the enforcement of the law, only one plot with all the co-owners managed to acquire the building license. But nothing actually, so they've done some infrastructure work, but nothing has actually been constructed. So no, you can't see any, but there are plans only on the...
And definitely none of the alternative housing.
They're still debating the location of the alternative housing.
Still, yeah, I mean, every day they
change. So what
change.
happened to the people who were displaced?
They're renting. Now they have it
all around. Yeah.
They're renting somewhere around, and then they have some little compensation to rent, but it's not enough. It wasn't sustainable and wasn't enough, so they had to move somewhere else. Eventually, when you live somewhere away for 5 or 6 years, 7 years, you won't go back to your original place, especially if the community doesn't exist there any longer.
And so if you don't have the financial means.
Just the act of letting people live somewhere else for 5 or 7 years means that you're intentionally displacing them, because they're not going to come again. Even here in the UK, if you're a refugee in the UK for 5 years, they won't ask you to go back. They say, okay, you can apply now for a permanent residency because you've been here, established your life in here, and it doesn't make sense. So international law recognizes that refugee or someone displaced after a certain period of time, he's permanently displaced, maybe.
Is there any convention? I don't know, there's a lot of lawyers in this gathering. Is there any convention about organized?
Internally displaced people, there are some rules and standards, but not a convention.
But in this case, so what's interesting in these cases, if interesting is a good word to use, is that the regime is very clever of making everything legal. So legal-wise, using internal legislation, no one can say this is unlawful. And such type of projects can be seen in London, in Brazil, in developing and in developed countries. And they are what they're called the gentrification processes, where you target disadvantaged areas with neoliberal investments, knowing that lawfully you're not actually preventing people from access to these areas, but you know that financially those people can never afford existing in this area after the development. So this is what the government did. They said, we took your informal ugly houses and we presented you with shares in a high-end luxurious development, but who actually could afford to go all the process to develop the land, or if because the rent allowance they got was not enough for them to rent even in suburban areas around Damascus, so majority opted for selling their shares so that they can liquidate the shares so that they can pay rent elsewhere. And definitely if this is their situation now, then they won't be able to go back and pay $6,000 per square meter to then buy or rent land in this development.
I mean, we need to understand as well the regime mentality at this stage. So they don't want to look like they're making another crime again, right? So now they're doing the legal thing. They're reconstructing the country. They're having the people, and by doing so, they kind of white whiten their image and then whitewash their image, and as well they have support from the local communities, because some of the people say, wow, now we have our own Dubai in here, for example. Okay, now we have this kind of icons and like nice looking buildings and so on. So some people fall into those narratives. So they're trying to work to play on those narratives and trying to be to look legal, but that doesn't say under the table as having that people being affected in a way or another.
Don't you think this is two different subjects, the war area and Damascus, these buildings?
Yes.
This is a different case to me. It doesn't look like it has got anything to do with the war or
it is, so
opposition to the government. This looks like, right now in London, we have London cleansing. They do exactly the same thing. Most of the housing towers are demolished and replaced by high-end apartments where they just pay to the people who have bought it, but they have bought it from council. They paid them like £200,000, and I got the cases that they are building instead of those and selling them for £4 million, three-bed apartments. So it looks like some kind of Damascus cleansing.
It happens. I mean, as I said, it happens everywhere around the world, and this is how it is. But so, there's something specific.
Why should we mix this with the other part of Syria, which is in a conflict of war and all that?
Because this is the pilot project for Decree 66, which puts the legal foundation of dealing with informal settlements in the current context, so the aftermath of the conflict. And then Decree 66 was then, as Hani said, was then taken out of the remit of informal settlement through Law Number 10. Law Number 10 created a lot of noise in the media, because then it doesn't just deal with informal settlement, but with all the land in Syria. Now here, no worries, here we have an example of how Law 10 will be enacted on the ground. So how Law 10 will actually manifest in practical sense on the ground. And if Law 10 is to be applied in East Aleppo and in Daraya and in Zabadani and all the areas where the communities were forcibly displaced, then this means that there's definitely not going back to their areas. First, because the law, for example, during the inspection and valuation, it requires that people present their documents to prove that they own the land and they have it, etc. When people are refugees and displaced, they don't have access to prove their properties. Automatically, their properties gets confiscated by the government, so it's now the government property. So in this way, they are maintaining the forced displacement that they did. So this project, it has all of its downsides when it's done in a context like in London, but in a context of war, it means that all population transfers and every sense of crimes or demographic engineering that happened during the war is now consolidated forever, because displaced communities do not have access to their own lands and to their own homes to start with, to claim their rights before actually going through all the hassle of the development.
And this is not an assumption, because the president himself came and said publicly that this is now a successful project and let's replicate it in other places. So they're using it as the model to do the reconstruction over all of Syria. So we're not just assuming that this might take place in other places. No, but this is their plan, and this is the pilot, as in the law, the example project for how they want to unfold reconstruction.
Has this process started elsewhere in the country, or at the moment it's just at the level of talks?
No, this is the real photo of the kind of the site of the construction. So now they have the infrastructure. They have the building. I mean, this is the tunnel way with the.
No, I mean, other than this pilot project at the moment, have there been similar projects elsewhere?
There are designated areas in other places for reconstruction. The most prominent one is another area called Basilia City, just off this area where we spoke about Daraya earlier. So it's Daraya and other areas around. They're now part of Basilia City, which is 4 times bigger than this one. And they're about to start doing that one.
I think they're now in the process of they're requesting people to come and prove their properties and
phase number 1.
Phase number 1, yeah, but nothing has actually been happening. So no evictions has yet been done. They're just still now inspecting and documenting property rights.
I mean, you need to remember that there is a lot of sanctions now applied on this kind of sector, reconstruction sector in Syria. So many, or many of the kind of big companies that might be interested in going and investing in construction project in Syria are still fearing to go into Syria. And then they didn't show the best example by Maruta city because it was too slow. So some of the companies are reluctant to continue, but they are pushing very hard that those projects go ahead.
Are you implying that because of war they can't go ahead with this project in Damascus? If there was no war, wouldn't this happen earlier?
If there is no war?
If there was no war at all, this kind of project wouldn't go ahead earlier in Damascus?
I don't see a reason why this kind of development wouldn't have happened eventually, because the Syrian economy was being liberalized when Bashar al-Assad came to power. So there is no reason why I can think of why such kind of projects wouldn't happen. But I think that the fact that it's happening as the blueprint for reconstruction is really critical and takes it to a different significant level.
If it caused back then evacuation of people, then it would have been as problematic as it is happening today. Maybe today it's more problematic because of those dynamics. But I mean, the conversation about informality and redeveloping the informal settlement was ongoing for ages in Syria. But the discussion was always kind of swinging between developing those areas, leaving them as they are, providing them with some infrastructure and some help to maintain their houses and making them in a better shape, or destroying them and building them again. And actually this was, the decision what to do was used as a political mean. In the early days of the demonstration, they said, well, now we give you the support, informal settlement will stay, we'll give you some money to renovate the area and upgrade them. But then after a while, when they found out this is not useful enough, they decided, okay, now let's go to the demolition decision. So it might have happened and might have not. It depends on the political circumstances back then. It was ongoing conversation.
Sorry, considering the photos, the modern building, and let's for a minute back to March 2011. Was Syria a developed country? Looking whole to small businesses and middle class people, jobs.
It was a developing country. It was a developing country, so it was developing. Developing, not developed.
Yeah.
But was developing.
Yeah. So
in general sense, we're speaking, half of the population in Syria across the different cities was living in informal settlements, and that's merely because the government failed to actually produce plans that would go in pace with how the population is growing and how urbanization is growing from cities towards the rural areas. So half of the population living in informal settlements might not be in the very dire conditions, but they still had very limited legal rights to do with their properties. And I think there is, so in Syria, for example, we did have high rates of unemployment, but we also had what we call the masked unemployment, or the masked...
Or secret.
Because people were employed in the public sector, but were they actually working?
Yeah.
They were not actually working, it was just the de facto, and also looking at the salaries of these of working in the public sector in general. Slowly after Bashar al-Assad came to power with the liberalization of the economy and everything, there was more space for private sector to work. But again, that was mostly crony investments, so you cannot actually invest unless you have connections and you have approvals from the government and from the allies of the government. I would say the middle class was slowly decreasing, and poverty was growing more and more, informality was growing more and more, and there was the elite layer that was actually growing more in terms of economic means and in terms of political connections.
But even those kind of rich people were having a lot of weaknesses, because the old kind of bourgeois level of people who had all the businesses, for example, let's say the Damascene people, the old kind of businessmen in Damascus, the regime was not really happy with every one of them. So the regime was fighting this group of people. People lost their job, many of them traveled, went to other countries to establish businesses, but another specific group of people who had enough connection with the government and made some partnership with people with connection with the government, their businesses flourished and they gained more money. So even this kind of level of people, class of people, had their own grievances, let alone all the grievances of the people of the informal settlement, the poorer people who, I remember, the rent, for example, like rent of a house in Damascus, very normal house would be around like 20,000, and then the salary would be 10,000. So a rent of a house is double of your salary. So imagine people would live in shared accommodation, and yes, we live in shared accommodation in the UK, but not to this level. So it was, and then I think, if you're trying to kind of tap into, it was better.
No, I'm just not saying better or worse.
Yeah.
I'm saying the process.
Yeah.
You said that it was developing. So can you tell me the process when started and when it was going to stop? The process of the development.
We thought as a new generation in 2000, when President Bashar al-Assad came into power, that the country is opening up. We call it the liberalization of Syria. And we were, as a new generation, somehow we felt happy that some kind of international investors are coming. We see some international company coming in, and so we thought that things are developing. But on the human rights and political freedoms, and we were not happy at all. And this is why, sometimes for my family, they would say maybe things are getting better economically in some of the aspects of life, although my own family and people I know were losing money all the time, and we're going from middle class to be like the poor people. But it was mainly, we cannot think only of political aspect. Was of economical aspects. It was the political aspect which dominated our perception of living in Syria, how we felt about living in Syria, freedom to move, to speak, to gather, to build your own businesses, to make a lecture without having to have a hundred of signature from the minister of whoever to make a small lecture in the public library. So it was those kind of aspects which dominated our life. Many people would say, well, Syria was better. And many people would say people rose because they were poor, and it's what it called, like economic revolution, but it wasn't. It was mainly human rights and political revolution. So yes, I see the point, but at the same time we try as much as possible not to kind of keep.
But I also think that we just borrowed the technical terms also, using developing and developed countries, or first world or third world, or global north and global south. So it was more to use the technical word to refer to non-European, non-Western.
It might be the result of the brainwashing that we've developed developing country. So they told us every day that we're developing country. We're much better than the.
I just said out the liberalism you used, because it wasn't liberalism.
No.
There was any freedom of speech.
No.
There wasn't any human rights protection. Yeah, there was a complete dictatorship, sectarism, and domination by the family of the Assads, like he and his cousins and somewhere. So that was my question. I think it's better to economically. I think that it was neoliberalism in economic and completely a dictatorship in the society, the sociology, all the sociology of Syria, the ethnic groups, the religious groups, and the others between the sectors of the Islam even, the Shia, the Sunni, the Alawis, the other, the Druze.
No, we call it that Syria was controlled by metal fist. This is how we feel like it's a metal fist, and no one can speak. And we say what we say like we used to say that walls had ears. So even when you're sitting in a room by yourself,
we have the same expression in Farsi.
You say the same. So be careful. You're speaking politics. Just
speaking whatever.
I was so you.
No, that's
So because you mentioned Daraya became a ghost town and still a ghost town, but then you mentioned that Daraya is one of the designated area for the same, like the similar urban planning.
Basilia City, yeah.
Yeah, not Daraya.
Yes,
No,
yes.
Daraya
yes.
for Basilia City.
Daraya is
It's
going to be called Basilia City.
Ah, okay.
Or part of Basilia City,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, and because and also you mentioned the checkpoints. So I was wondering if the checkpoints are still around Daraya or the larger area of Basaya City, and also because we know from the work of our Syrian friends that Iran and Iran affiliated militia were deeply involved in besieging Daraya and then the fall of the city, that part of the city. So I was wondering if they are still, those areas are still under the control of the Iranian forces, and also the area around the airport, if you have any.
Daraya is not far from here, but I think you're referring to this
No. The airport
Daraya City is still blocked, and there are checkpoints. People are not allowed to go in. Even families will have houses in there. They, in some occasions, if they had enough money to pay bribes or enough connections to kind of have exemptions to go in, they managed to go in to visit their property for one day and leave again on the same day.
I think they also introduced a formal mechanism where you go register your name that you want to go and check on your property or get in there, and then they consider the names and then they issue clearance for certain names, allowing them to come in for one day again, just to check on the situation and leave.
But no one is living there. It's still, you're not allowed to live in there. You might have access to visit, but not to live.
But nothing has been started in terms of reconstruction.
No.
There.
It's just designated on
Because
plans.
I've heard about a plan to build a shopping mall and also some
That's part of
apartments around.
Basilia City. That's how they call the whole area. So it's Daraya and Al-Qaboon and different other areas around it. And these are all included, so it's a huge development, such as in Marota City. So it's not just residential, it's also retail and malls and offices and everything. So that's what's going to happen there. The area is designated. It was the area 2 of Decree 66, and then after the issue of Law Number 10, it's now being developed under Law Number 10. So Law Number 10 is the legal framework for that. And it's just now in early phases, and also there's no transparency around what's going on, and because of all the delays with this project, so it's also affecting on the other. There are discussions, for example, that the alternative housing for displaced people from this location will be located in Daraya, in Basilia City. That actually includes Daraya. People are completely checking whether it's time to register their ownership rights so that they don't get, their property doesn't get expropriated, get taken by the government without compensation. So it's in that stage, still in the stage of actually people documenting their rights until formal procedures take place with inspection and valuation and everything.
But there is, because you mentioned something about the Iranian interest in the area, on a social level, among the community who lived in those areas, people from Daraya, many of them speak about this interest of Iranian militia coming. During the besiegement of Daraya, there was a lot of Iranian militia, and they came there under, saying that they're protecting some sort of maqam in the area, shrine in the area, and so this is a holy site in the area, and therefore there might be an interest to live in the area afterward, or they might kind of reward some of those fighters, for example, with some of the houses in the area and so on. So people have those kind of ideas roaming around, but we don't know for certain that this is what's going to happen.
I think it's also widely, locally known that the Iranians are mostly interested in the eastern part of Syria and Deir ez-Zor. So formerly ISIS-held areas, but that's where you actually, lots of the confiscated properties was awarded for Iranian militias, and you have Iranian investors coming and buying land in there now.
Why? Because it's Sunni people? Or?
No, because it's near the border, and also near the border with the land bridge.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question, and maybe it might be a recommendation for your project. I'm impressed by what you have presented. Well, I think that you missed 2 points, very important points, because mostly you focused on domestic law rather than taking a general vision of one, the geopolitics of Syria, to what extent the geopolitics of Syria contributes to the formulation of such policies and discriminatory policies, enforced displacement, and to what extent international contribute to such atrocities, because we know that domestic and international law, they reconstruct each other. So constitution constructs international legal system, international legal system reconstructs the constitution. But from what you have said about the liberalization of the whole society from the 2002, so it gives me a sense that what matters right now is the liberal values. Whoever implements those liberal values in such important geopolitical phase is the winner. So domestic law, or let's say the decree number 10, is from someone we know who is he, a dictator. But you never mentioned any, you never attributed any of those atrocities to international law and international community. Yeah. And this is, if you really want to publicize it, if you want to go beyond it, so you have to do it, because Dean Sharp and Graham, mostly they were influenced by all those conventions, how they came up with those three manifestations. You know? So it's all the, from the articles of the genocide and the displacement and those between universal declarations of human and social rights. So how could you use the same tools to also blend the international community?
I think so. We perhaps ending usually the discussion with Reconstruction shifts all the light to speak about neoliberalism and Reconstruction. But what we usually like to, the message that we want to deliver is that Reconstruction can never be viewed separately from destruction, and as how we view it is just a continuation of the destruction, and we call it a destructive Reconstruction because it's in no way presenting a new face for the country. It's just a continuation of all the systematic destruction and herbicide practices that we presented in the first. And I think speaking of forced displacement, of targeting of civilian facilities, of demolition, illegal demolitions of houses, these are all crimes documented by, so our source of information is the human rights documentation organization, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, PAX in Holland, etc. So, of course, we acknowledge that these entail crimes against humanity and more crimes. And I think there is a lot of link with how whatever is happening in Syria in urban sense and in different senses is violating international law. But I think also the big question in here is about enforcement more than actually law, right? Because we have the frameworks in place, but who is at this context able to enforce whatever is in the international law? Like we have impunity in place, and we have all the rehabilitation of a dictatorship government. So yes, they're blocking Reconstruction Fund, but on all other aspects, they're trying to rehabilitate the system in Syria. They're accepting Bashar al-Assad as the de facto president to save the geopolitics of the area, so that they don't take it into further mess. And also, so we can see countries reopening their embassies in Syria. We can see businesses happening, etc. So I think more than a question of violating international law, which everyone acknowledges and it's widely documented with Syrian and international human rights organizations, it's what enforcement measures we have to make sure that whatever is provided for in the international law will actually be applied, so we can hold Bashar al-Assad and his regime accountable for these crimes.
If you want to question about the another town you showed, I think it was called Abou.
Abou.
Yeah, you showed a picture of that before, and the demolition, the post recapture the demolition. Imagine that I am, let's say I am the owner of one of those houses in the middle of the picture, right? And it was a house. I owned the land. Maybe it was an informal area, but I owned the land. I had documents about the land, and it was a house. It was a two-story. What happens now? I am outside Syria now. What happens now? What's the process of this? If I want to, and I wasn't particularly against Assad, I wasn't supportive of Assad, I was just a normal guy.
And if it depends, if it comes as part, if it becomes part of the designated area for reconstruction, then there is a procedure. The first phase of it is that you go and claim your land. So the government doesn't really recognize that they have all the record. Although they have the record, but they say no, you have to come and claim the land. For many people,
in person,
or sometimes appoint someone from the family to go on there. But in many cases, I have my own family or other people I know, they don't have any family member in the country who can go and do this for them. Or in many cases, they can go, they have someone to go, but they fear to go and kind of to go to Syria. For example, you're in there, you escape Syria because of security reason, so you won't go and put your life at risk just to go and claim your property. So, and for those procedural kind of requirements, many of the people couldn't really claim the land. Many people actually didn't hear or didn't know about the call to claim the land. This is kind of only two examples of how complicated it is. And
it's also the time frame, right?
Exactly. It doesn't work within this time. If it's peacetime and people have free access to Syria, then yes, you can say this. But now within this context, it seems that it's an attempt to, because in the first place they have all the record. It's the government. They have everything written in paper. They have copy of everything. Why to call people to prove their ownership?
I think with Decree 66, it was only 1 month time slot that you have to go and actually claim your property rights. And then, so those people who were evicted, they were subjected to this, but then with law number 10 becoming the actually formal law across to guide reconstruction in all geographies, it also started with 1 month time slot, and then it made a huge noise, mostly by governments, European governments who host the large number of refugees such as Germany, but also regionally Lebanon. They really made a lot of fuss around this law because with 1 month it means that all refugees, the property of all refugees is going to be confiscated, and then people will be, refugees will be stuck in their refuge countries. So there was an international campaign, and then the government extended the time frame to 1 year. 1 year for you to go personally or to appoint a legal representative or a family member. But still, again, so we are speaking about refugees, but we're also speaking about internally displaced people in opposition-held areas where they don't have access. We're speaking about detainees people for years without any legal status. So the government says no, we don't have them. And then family members, they don't know, they're sure they're detained, but they don't have any legal proof. None of them can go and claim because then they are not legally appointed. Family members are not legally appointed by those disappeared, kidnapped, or detained. And we also have all the dead people and martyrs, killed people, who also didn't they don't have the legally appointed representative to actually go.
The problem is that even if they manage to confiscate kind of half of the property or 30% of the property, people who own the rest, they might not really want to go back and live in those areas anymore. They say, well, all our neighbors or our families, everyone is not there anymore. We've been living abroad. Let's sell this house for anything and leave. So
one important thing is that we perhaps spoke in details about Decree 66 and Law 10 because they are guiding reconstruction, but these come within a whole set of legislative legislations that were issued to facilitate all of this. One important law is Law number 10, which deals with the rubble. And in many cases, such demolitions are actually justified by rubble removal. So the inspection committee of the government will say that this building is actually in a status that does not allow it to be inhabitable in the future, so we demolish it, so it's rubble. And then there's a whole law that deals with that, because you're also required to go and claim the property of the destructed things and be responsible for the removal of the rubble and everything. So also manipulation is happening through that. What actually qualifies as an inact building and what's rubble to be removed. That's another example of laws manipulating properties.
I think it was very intense and a lot of information, and thanks so much. I think it would be nice to maybe continue talking as we start eating and drinking, so that we can, our brain can start actually working. Thanks so much. And also we have these lists, like if people would like to be part of the monthly events that we're gonna be hosting more, please put your email address here. And also if you have ideas that you would like to also give presentations here like this, share ideas, everybody's welcome. This is like a kind of a public space. We want to keep it that way. But thanks a lot, Hani and Sawsan.
Thank you so much for
the way law and military kind of overlaps is like really scary.
Thank you very much for everyone. It was very nice for us to kind of present our work in the front of you, especially being like from an area which we were interested in, we don't know anything about, which is very scary as well. So very interesting.
This is the beginning of collaboration. This is not gonna end here like this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.